So we've seen what the teams have to offer after the first round in Bahrain, and we've got an initial view of where the teams and drivers stack up. With this information in mind, and a view of how the Formula 2 drivers are getting on, I thought I'd pull together my 2022 driver lineup predictions. Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Just before I jump into it, I want to offer a quick caveat that you're not going to agree with all of these predictions, so please don't get upset if your favourite driver doesn't end up in a Mercedes. To be honest, nobody knows at this point what the driver lineup will be for next year, and if you don't agree, then feel free to let me know in the comments, but make sure to be nice about it. And as always, please do consider hitting that subscribe button as well. The teams not changing. I'm going to start off with the teams that won't be changing for 2022 in my opinion, and after so much change for this season, I actually think it will be 5 teams that stick with the same drivers for next year. And I think it's a sensible move, given there's going to be so much change in other areas with the new technical regulations for next season. Starting off with Red Bull, and I think they'll stick with Verstappen and Perez for 2022. Max Verstappen is their poster boy and is undoubtedly the number one driver at that team. Plus, from the looks of things, Red Bull has the best car for 2021 at the moment, so he won't be tempted to go anywhere else for next year. So he'll be staying, and alongside him, I've gone for Sergio Perez, as he's definitely the strongest driver that's been in that seat for a number of years. I expect him to do a good job this year, and be able to be a bit of a nuisance to the Mercedes cars, and that's exactly what he's there to do. Another pretty obvious one next, and I've got the Ferrari team sticking with Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz for 2022. It makes sense, as both drivers actually have a contract that covers 2022 anyway, and I reckon both of them will do a great job this year as the team starts to recover from the lows of 2020. They'll probably want some stability in that driver lineup with the new regulation changes, as they attempt to get back to being a front-running team in Formula 1 again. The big question for Ferrari though will be what they do for 2023, with Mick Schumacher being lined up to get that second seat at the team. Next up is McLaren, and I have the Papaya team sticking with Lando Norris and Daniel Ricciardo for 2022. They have one of the best driver lineups on the grid, and as long as it stays harmonious between the two drivers this year, they'll have no reason to change either of their drivers, in my opinion. They're both very strong, and there aren't any junior drivers knocking at the door of Formula 1 right now in the McLaren Academy, so there should be no reason for McLaren to change. I've then got Aston Martin, and this team has a driver who's got a seat for as long as he likes in Lance Stroll, and a new driver for 2021 in Sebastian Vettel, that's bringing championship winning experience to their team. And as with the previous teams I've looked at so far, I see no reason for the team to change. They've just made the move to swap out Sergio Perez for Sebastian Vettel, and I doubt they'll want to change their drivers again anytime soon. Plus, Vettel's joined on a multi-year deal, and given the new regulations are just around the corner, both parties will want him to stick around for that. And the final team that I have in this section of teams not making a switch is Haas, as I think they'll continue with Mick Schumacher and Nikita Mazepin. Schumacher's touted for a Ferrari seat in 2023, as I mentioned earlier, but I believe he'll really need to impress the Italian team to get that move, and I don't really see it happening after a single season. Plus, the German driver tends to improve in his second season in a category, so I think he'll be a safe bet to stay with Haas for next year. And then, well, if you learned anything from Drive to Survive Series 3, it's that Haas is struggling for cash right now. The team's new title sponsor, Uralkali, seem to have a fair amount of control over the team, so it looks like Mazepin's here to stay, even if he does like to spin around more than Kylie Minogue. Teams making a change. So we've seen the 5 teams sticking, and now we have the other 5 teams that I can see making a switch for 2022. The first team to mention in this group is AlphaTauri, and when Yuki Tsunoda graduated from Formula 2 at the end of last year, it marked the start of the team's return towards having 2 younger drivers from the Red Bull Driver Academy. I think Yuki's set to have a great season, and his debut performance in Bahrain was quite impressive. Not only does the Japanese driver have the skill and potential, I also think he's a great character to have in the paddock, and is likely to impress people with his skill throughout the 2021 season. So I see no reason for the team to not retain Tsunoda for 2022. Then you have the other seat, and as I've said before, I think it's got to be the end of the road for Pierre Gasly in a Red Bull owned seat. He's a great driver and has proven this on a number of occasions over the last few years, and he's capable of becoming a solid midfield driver. I can see him potentially having a similar career to Sergio Perez in a way, where he was given the chance at a top team too early in his career to then need a midfield team to take a chance on him. But from a Red Bull perspective, which is the lens that we need to look at these seats from, given it's really Helmut Marko deciding, I think they won't see the potential in keeping Gasly in one of those seats, when they have so many other potential options waiting in other categories. As for taking this seat then, I think you first need to consider Alex Albon, the driver that has been dropped from the main team, who's got just 12 races with Toro Rosso before being promoted to Red Bull. Personally, I think he deserves a shot, but people have a very short-term memory in Formula 1 and it's very easy to be forgotten about. I think that driving a DTM won't help him too much, as he won't get the level of exposure when compared to other drivers vying for the AlphaTauri seat. And as for those others, it's the 3 drivers currently racing in Formula 2. You've got Juri Vips, Liam Lawson and Jehan Daruvala. Now all 3 of these drivers on their day have a shot at reaching the top 3 in the championship, which guarantees a driver enough points for a super license. But actually none of these 3 drivers actually need that in order to get the required super license points to graduate into Formula 1, as they're all fairly close to passing that threshold anyway. Lawson and Daruvala have had a strong weekend in Bahrain last week, and sit 2nd and 3rd in the championship respectively. Meanwhile, Vips had a tough weekend as his car was found to be breaching the regulations, which baffles me considering they're all made by Dallara, but that's a different point entirely. Basically what I'm trying to say is that I expect Alex Albon will be a bit gutted when watching these 3 make inroads in Formula 2, as if any one of them mounts a title challenge in what is looking to be a very strong season, they'll probably end up getting the nod for that F1 seat. In terms of my prediction though, I'm going for Liam Lawson, and to be honest, I couldn't really give you a particular reason for that, as I think any one of them could get that seat for 2022, but that's just another reason that the Formula 2 Championship is so exciting this year. So it's Yuki Tsunoda and Liam Lawson in the AlphaTauri seats for me. Next up, I have Alfa Romeo to make a change to their driver lineup. The team has a seat known as the Ferrari seat and a seat which is known as the Sauber seat, and currently Giovinazzi sits in the Ferrari seat and Raikkonen in the Sauber seat. But for me, I can see this changing for 2022, mostly because Raikkonen's at an age where I can't imagine he's too interested in sticking around for the new regulations. Kimi is a part owner of Sauber, and so I'm sure he'll have an option to extend his contract for another year. So if he chooses to stay, I wouldn't be surprised, but personally I think he'll move away from the sport at the end of this season. Meanwhile, I think the Ferrari-owned seat will change. Giovinazzi's in his 3rd season in the sport, and let's be honest, he hasn't exactly set the world alight. He's undoubtedly improved over his time in the sport so far, and is now looking capable of competing with Raikkonen at most races, which is why he's been kept on by Ferrari and Alfa Romeo for the 2021 season. Plus, of course, he's an Italian driver, which is great from a Ferrari media perspective. But the Ferrari decision to take Carlos Sainz for the vacant seat of the team last year says a lot about the team's thoughts on Giovinazzi's talent. So I think Ferrari will make a switch to Robert Schwartzman for next year, provided he has a strong Formula 2 season. And whilst it hasn't gone too well for the Prema drivers so far after round 1 in Bahrain, I find it hard to believe that the Russian driver won't come back stronger in the next few events in the F2 calendar, and match some of the performances that we saw of him last year. Another option would be Callum Ilott for that seat, but much like Alex Albon, I think Ilott's probably missed his chance at a Formula 1 seat for 2022. But that leaves a question over who takes Kimi Raikkonen's or the Sauber seat for 2022. And the first option for this seat is a driver that could well be a future Formula 1 star. Théo Pourchaire is the youngest driver on the F2 grid at the moment at just 17 years old, and he was the runner-up in the Formula 3 Championship last season behind Oscar Piastri. He's got bags of potential, and I think he will be in Formula 1 in the near future, but perhaps not for 2022. Instead of Pourchaire, I think it will actually be Giovinazzi moving across into the Sauber seat for 2022, for his 4th season in Formula 1. I think Gio will be in a great position to take on the lead role for the team for next season, as the new regulations come into effect. He's a talented driver and one that knows the team, so it makes sense that Alfa Romeo take him on and move into the Sauber seat at the team. I think he'll be swiftly moved on from the team though if Théo Pourchaire mounts a title challenge in Formula 2 over the next few years. So Giovinazzi and Schwartzman in the Alfa Romeo in 2022 for me. Next up it's Mercedes, and this team has a huge bearing on what happens in the driver market for 2022. They realistically have 3 drivers, all with a year left on their contracts, going for the 2 seats at this team for 2022, in Lewis Hamilton, Valtteri Bottas and George Russell. Realistically, Hamilton will be staying if he wants to, and with this season looking like it's going to be one of the closest championship battles in the turbo hybrid era, they'll really need to rely on Hamilton's ability to pull a win when it isn't expected, just as he did last weekend in Bahrain. So I think he'll be there again for next year. But as for the next seat, well, you have the option of going for youth, giving George Russell an opportunity to learn from the more experienced Lewis Hamilton, or sticking with Valtteri Bottas, who's the safe bet, given he's been at the team for 5 years by that point. As you know, I've put the Mercedes team in the second section of this video, so they will be making a driver change, in my opinion, which makes it quite obvious that I've decided to go for George Russell to take that second seat at Mercedes for 2022. Realistically, if they don't promote George now, then he could start to look outside the Mercedes driver programme for alternative options. He has a huge amount of talent and has proven himself in the Williams car, and of course in his debut performance for the Mercedes team at the Sakhir Grand Prix last season. It's a good opportunity to bring him into the team to learn from Hamilton in the champion's last few years in the sport. And who knows, he may even challenge Lewis for championships. So Hamilton and Russell at Mercedes for me. Next up, Alpine. And this team is one that I think will need to make a switch for 2022. The driver lineup at the team is currently made up of Fernando Alonso and Esteban Ocon. I think it's safe to say that Alonso will stick around for 2022. Not only is he under contract, but his return seems to be a bit of a gamble on the new regulations, and Alpine delivering a race-winning car. So I expect that seat will be held by the Spaniard for 2022. As for the second seat, well, I think Esteban Ocon is potentially heading towards his final chance in Formula 1 this season. There's no reason why he couldn't prove himself to be capable of keeping his seat at Alpine or moving to another team for 2022 if he has an impressive season this year. But personally, I don't think this guy's future sits with Alpine. So to take his seat, well, there are a few options here. The first option would be to look internally at the Alpine Young Driver Programme. There are 3 drivers that spring to mind in Formula 2, Christian Lundgaard, Guan Yu Zhou and Oscar Piastri. In a similar way to the Red Bull drivers, all 3 of these guys will be fighting at the sharp end of the F2 grid this year. I reckon Zhou and Piastri probably have the best shot at making it to Formula 1 in the future, with Piastri being the younger of the two and the reigning Formula 3 champion. But I think once again, the Alpine Driver Academy will be ignored, as it has been for a number of years, to instead bring in a more experienced option. There are a few to look at here, from the likes of Pierre Gasly, who's largely associated with the team because of the French connection there, and then whoever falls out of the Mercedes trio that are fighting it out for those 2 coveted seats in the championship winning team. So in my opinion, Valtteri Bottas. Now if you think about this from a marketing aspect, it's a no-brainer to recruit Gasly and benefit from the team having another French driver in the French team. But in my opinion, if Alpine wants to be a front-running team in these new regulations, then they should choose Valtteri Bottas. He's proven to be a safe pair of hands and wouldn't step on Alonso's toes too much if they find themselves to be challenging up at the front, so it could be a good move for the team. So I've gone for Alonso and Bottas at Alpine. And then finally we're left with a Williams team that have a missing driver, as George Russell has moved up to the Mercedes team in my predictions. I think they'll stick with Latifi, as they are of course struggling for sponsors, and he brings a number of different sponsors and valuable funds for the team. However, Russell's really their main driver, the one that delivers for them, particularly on a Saturday, so they need a strong replacement for him. Looking at their driver academy, it's pretty thin on the ground. There's Aitken, who's obviously their reserve driver, Nissany, who's their test driver, but perhaps the most likely candidate from within their driver academy is, dare I say it, Dan Ticktum. He's had quite the history from his time in the Red Bull Academy, but now he probably looks like the best option from a speed perspective. But I don't think they'll take anyone within their academy, as none of them are really up to scratch in my opinion. So it gives them the option of going for Esteban Ocon or Pierre Gasly, in terms of the drivers that are available based on my picks so far, and maybe a few others who are outside the sport as well. I think they would probably choose Pierre Gasly, based on the fact that he's won a race recently, and is likely to perform better than Ocon this season. But if, and it is a big if, Esteban Ocon stays under the Mercedes management with a view to potentially promote him into the Lewis Hamilton seat in a few years' time once Lewis chooses to leave the sport, then maybe they'll want Ocon to stay in the sport and continue to gain that valuable experience to potentially partner George Russell at Mercedes long term. It makes sense. The seat at Williams is already occupied by a Mercedes driver, and it would mean the two teams could strike a similar deal in terms of their engine supply. He's an experienced driver that could find his form again in the future, as he did with Force India just a few years ago. So it's potentially an out there prediction, but I'm actually going to go for Esteban Ocon to make the switch to Williams in 2022. So it's Latifi and Ocon at Williams for me. So there's my 2022 driver lineup predictions. I've tried my best to explain each decision, but do let me know in the comments if you think that any of my logic is completely wrong. To be honest, I don't expect it to be right, as the Formula 1 driver market always throws up surprises. Overall in my predictions, it's Pierre Gasly who's the big loser in all this. A talented driver that deserves a spot on the grid, but could find himself out of a seat come 2022. I do hope he is able to find a team if his time at AlphaTauri comes to an end, but time will tell on this one. Let me know your thoughts on my 2022 driver lineup predictions in the comments, and if you've enjoyed this video and watched this far, then please leave it a like and subscribe for more F1 content in the future.